Hello everyone, this is Professor Robert Solis. Welcome to this video lesson. We're going to be talking about user-defined functions, or more simply put, we're going to be talking about functions. So let me switch over here to a Visual Studio program that I've already created, a C++ program. And first let me talk about what a function is. A function is a chunk of code that you call upon, and it does something over and over and over again, right? So when we call a function, that's a chunk of code that we want to execute over and over and over again. So the first thing that you have to do is you have to declare what's called the function prototypes. So the function prototypes, that's kind of like the table of contents for a textbook. It kind of tells you the overall description of what it is that you're looking for, or what it is that you're describing. And then at the very bottom, after the main program, we have our function definitions, and that's where we're fleshing out the actual function prototype to define what it actually does. So let's say, for example, that I want to create a function that finds the minimum of two numbers. Well, here is the name of the function. It's called findMin. This thing over here indicates what it's going to return, and the stuff inside of the parentheses indicates the arguments that you are sending to this function. So in this case, I have a function that I'm going to create. It's called findMin. In this case, I'm sending two arguments, namely two integers. The first one I'm going to call xpar, the next one I'm going to call ypar for parameter. Now, what findMinimum will do is it will find the smaller of these two, and it will return an integer, namely the smaller of xpar or ypar. So that's how this works out in terms of finding a minimum number. Now, what if I wanted to create another function to find the max, but I don't want to return anything? Well, that's what this thing over here does. In this case, find max once again receives two parameters. Here's the first integer, here's the second integer, but notice that it doesn't return anything. That's what the word void means. So if you see the word void, what that means is it doesn't return anything. This function returns an integer. This function does not return anything. Now, functions do not necessarily have to have arguments. For example, in this case, I'm creating a function called getUserInput. Notice that inside the parentheses, we have a blank. So this function receives no parameters. And in fact, look at what it returns. It returns nothing. How about this function over here? This function returns no parameters. I'm sorry, it has no parameters, and it returns an integer. So there's all kinds of mixing and matching. Perhaps I can show you by using my graphics software here. It's kind of like this chart that you have, where you have, you have a function. Oops, function with parameters. You can also have a function without parameters. So I'll say with no parameters. And let's complete our table by doing something like that. And then we can have a situation like this, where we can say, does it return something? Or maybe there is no return value. Okay. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said return. So let's go back over here to our program. FindMin, you notice that it has parameters and it returns something. So it has parameters and it returns something. That's an example of this guy right here. How about this one over here? This function looks like it has parameters and it doesn't return anything. So this one does have parameters, but it doesn't return anything. All right, how about this guy over here? This function has no parameters and it doesn't return anything. So it has no parameters and it does not return anything. That's an example of this over here. And then finally, we can have functions that do not have parameters, but they do return something. So no parameters, but they do return something, and that's what this example is. So that's pretty much all the possibilities that you have when it comes to functions. And in this case, I'm going to give you a demonstration of each one of those. Now, before I continue, you'll notice that I've also created a couple of global variables, namely global num1 is an integer, global num2 is an integer. In general, you want to be steering away from creating or declaring global variables. They can lead to problems. It's not that they're bad, it's they're discouraged. But maybe in a particular program that you're writing, that's the only way to maintain efficiency, or maybe that's the only way that your boss perhaps wants you to write your program. In general, you're supposed to stay away from global variables, but again, they're not evil, they're not bad. It's just something that's by convention not recommended to do very often. All right, so over here we have our main program, as you can see here. But actually, before I talk about the main program, let me illustrate what's happening here. Once you have completed your function prototypes, after your int main program, you go all the way to the bottom and then you declare those program or declare those functions. So over here, you'll see that find min has the exact same header or top line of code, with exception to the semicolon. So that semicolon is missing over here. Instead, it's replaced with a curly braces, and then we flesh out what this find min is going to do. And in this case, what does find min do? Well, first of all, you've just given me two numbers. I want to find the smaller of the two. Well, if x parameter is greater than y parameter, then I'm going to say that smaller of the two is y parameter. Otherwise, smaller of the two is x parameter. Now, because this function is supposed to return an integer, I better make sure to have a return statement. As you can see over here, what this return statement does is it's going to return the variable smaller of the two. All right, for this function over here called find max, notice that it also receives two parameters and it doesn't return anything. All right, so then I just simply have to use an if statement to ask the question, if x parameter is in fact greater than y parameter, then I'm going to send out a statement that says this: the larger of this number or this number is, and then in this case it's x parameter. Otherwise, I have an else statement and I'm flopping these around, right? The larger of x and y is y parameter. So that's how this function works. It's a chunk of code that if I call upon it, if I give it two numbers, it'll find the maximum of those two. In this particular function called getUserInput, it's responsible for, as you can see here, obtaining the user input. When it does that, it's not supposed to return anything. Okay, so what do? I have a cout statement that says to the user, enter integer 1. So they're going to enter that, and notice where that's being placed into that global num1 variable. Now, by the way, I'm not sure if I mentioned this in the past. If you want to split the screen for Visual Studio, you can grab this guy right here and drag it and drop it. It allows you to split the screen, so that way I can go to the top over here and I can remind you guys, here's the top of the screen with the two global variables over here, and here we are on the bottom of the screen looking at our get user input. So let me just take this guy over here, scroll down a little bit more. There we go. Okay, so when I ask the user for an integer, it's going to be placing it into global num1, which as you can see is a global variable, specifically an integer. Now I'm going to ask the user to enter enter integer number 2, and that's going to be placing it into global num2, which is over here. All right. Now I want to find out the smaller of these two. Well, I already have a function that does that. So that function is called find min. So what this does is it sends out a statement. The smaller of these two numbers is, and then I'm going to call a function. And this function, what do I give it? Global num1, global num2. What this thing is going to return, as we've seen already, is the smaller of these two. Okay, so can I call functions within functions? Absolutely. Can I call functions within functions, within functions, within functions, ad nauseum? Absolutely. All right, finally, let's go over here to our last function definition, and that's called user age, get user age. Notice that it doesn't send us any parameters, but it does return an integer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to declare a variable inside of this function called age. And I'm going to ask the user a question. How old are you? Once the user enters that number, we're going to place that into the variable age. This is what I need to send back. This is what I'm supposed to do, get the user age. So what do? I return age. And that's exactly what this is supposed to do. As you can see over here, this is supposed to return an integer. Specifically, we're returning the person's age. All right, let me go ahead and scroll back up here. Now that you've got your functions declared, you can use them in your main program. So here's our main program, and over here I've declared variable 1, num1, num2, also minimum value. I've blocked out some code, or I've commented out some code, and I'm going to deal with this at first, but I just wanted to show you kind of piece by piece what we're doing. Let's say, for example, that I do something like this. I'm going to get the user input, and that means I'm going to call this particular function. So from here, I jump down to get user input. So that'd be this guy over here. What is this going to do? Obtain the number 1 and the number 2. It's going to place it into global num1, global num2. I'm going to send out the statement. The smaller of these two numbers is, and then I have a function call that receives these two numbers, and it's going to return to me the smaller of those two. Once it returns the smaller of those two, then I'll say you are, and then I'll ask the user for their age. So down over here, I'm going to call this function called getUserAge. The user will enter in a number, and then we're going to return that. Well, when we return that value, all we're going to do is we're going to send it out via the cout statement. So let's run the code, but I want to stop the program right here. So I'm going to place a break right here so I can show you how to step-by-step go through this function, or go through this program, and also understand the usage of the debugging tools. So let me go ahead and start the debugging mode, and over here I'm stopping the code over here where it says get user input. Now you'll see your various debugging statements over here, your debugging buttons. Maybe you don't see these. What you can do is over here next to help in this blank area, you can right click, and you'll notice that I have debug selected. So let me uncheck that. Hey, those buttons aren't there. So let me right click, tap on debug. Now I see these tools, and I'm going to hover on top. So over here, this is called show next statement. This one's step into, this one's step over, this one is step out. I want to step into this function. I want to see what's going on inside. So I'm going to tap on this button over here, or F11. So I'm going to tap here, and now I'm inside of this function where it's called get user input. Okay, so at this point then, I can either click the step into or step over. That's fine. So I'm going to click step over. Notice that the yellow arrow is over here. We are about to send out a cout statement. Okay, let me step over. We have that in the output. Now I need to get the value and put it into global num1. Right now, if I hover over global num1, it's equal to 0. Okay, so let me go ahead and step over. It brings me back to my screen. Okay, let's say that I enter 5. Press enter. All right, now you'll notice that the yellow arrow is over here. Let me click over here. I am now going to ask the user to enter integer number 2. So I'll just simply click step over, and then I'll step over again. The user is expected to enter a number, so I'll enter the number 10. Say, for example, press enter. All right, so now I'm about to send this out to the console. The smaller of these two numbers is. Now, the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to call a function called findMin. So let me step into this function. So over here, I'm going to click step into. Look at this. Now I'm in findMin. And look at this. X parameter is 5 and Y parameter is 10. Those are the two numbers that were entered by the user. You can also see it in my autos panel over here with the values of X par and Y par are. Okay, so now that I'm inside of this find min, I can go ahead and step over, and I have an if statement. Well, let's see here. This is 5. Is 5 greater than 10? No, that's a false statement. So when I step over, notice it goes to the else statement, and what am I doing? I am going to assign X par to the smaller of the two, because that is, in fact, the smaller of the two between 5 and 10. So smaller of the two is now going to be assigned 5, and you can see that over here. And now that's what's going to be returned. So this function is going to return the number 5. All right, so I returned that. So let me just go ahead and say step over. And guess what? Now we're back over here in this cout statement. The smaller of these two numbers is. And that was a function call. Well, what is the function call returning? The number 5. So this thing in essence is the number 5. The smaller of these two is 5. Okay, so let me go ahead and step. And I'm going to step over. That takes me back over here. And now I have a new thing that I'm going to be presenting. By the way, let me just switch over to the output. And you can see here the smaller of these two numbers is 5. So that's what I've got on the output so far. Now I have another cout statement. This cout statement is going to ask how old you are. So let me go ahead and step into, because I want to step into this function over here called getUserAge. So I'm going to step into. Here it is. And so let me step over, how old are you? All right, I'm going to get the user input for their age. So let's say that they're 21 years old. So they type in 21, how old are you? 21 years old, press enter. Let me click back over here. Now that age is 21, that's the value that I'm going to return. All right, so one other thing that I can do is I can also click this guy over here, step out, which steps out of the function. So I can demonstrate that for you now by clicking this. Now we are back at the calling function. Here is that calling function. You are, this thing is what? 21. So you are 21 years old is about to be displayed onto the screen. So why don't I go ahead and now continue, because there's really no other code to execute. So I'll go ahead and click continue. That's going to show me the output. You are 21 years old. And that's how you run the program using these two functions. Okay, so let me remove that break. And now I'm going to comment this part out. So let me just use a block comment for this. I'll go over here, block comment that out. And now let me remove this block comment so we can see how this works. Okay, now in this case, once again, I'm going to ask the user for an integer, number 1 and integer number 2. Notice that I'm doing that within the main program. Previously, I did that within a function. All right, so what am I going to do? After I have obtained the numbers 1 and 2, I'm going to send those to find min. Find min is going to, so whatever this is, it's going to be placed over here. Whatever this is, it's going to be placed over here. Find min is going to return the smaller of those two, and I'm going to place that into a variable called min value. Well, at this point, then I'm going to say the smaller of this number, or whatever this number is min value, the number that I just received back from that function. And then over here, I'm going to call this function called find max. Now, notice that this thing doesn't return anything. It's a statement that stands on its own. How does that work out? Well, if I scroll down, you'll notice that for find max, once I call it, it's going to receive X parameter and Y parameter, and it already has an if statement to determine the larger of the two, and it will display an appropriate cout statement to indicate, hey, the larger of this number and that number is, and then it's going to display it. All right, so why don't we do this? Let's kind of work through this code, and again, I'm going to place a break, let's say right here at the cout statement. Actually, you know what? Let me place a break right here, just before the entry of the function, right here. And let's run the program. This way it'll allow me to enter the two numbers over here where it says enter integer 1, enter integer 2. So once again, I'll type in 5 and 10, press enter. Oops, and press enter. All right, so notice that the yellow arrow is stopping over here. We are about to call a function called find min. Well, let me step into that function by clicking this guy over here, step into. So we're going to step into find min. Notice that this is 5. Notice that this is 10. And so as I execute through the code, we're going to find the smaller of the two. It looks like X bar is the smaller of the two. And now 5 is going to be returned. So let me step out of this program and go back over here. So what is this thing? Well, according to this thing is returning 5. So 5 is about to be assigned into minimum value. All right. So if I step over here, it says the smaller of num1, which is 5, and num2, which is 10, is minimum value, which is 5. So let me just step over this. I'm going to switch back over here to the output console, and notice what you see. The smaller of 5 or 10 is 5. All right. Next, we're going to call this function over here called find max. So let me step into that so I can see what's happening. So I'm going to click this guy over here, F11, step into here. Here's the number 5. Here's the number 10 being represented by these two variables, X par and Y par. All right, so now I can just simply step over. If 5 is greater than 10, oh, that's not true. So therefore, we're going to go to the else statement, and we're going to say the larger of 5 or 10 is, and in this case, it's going to output the number 10. So if I execute this, and if I go back over here to my output, you see the larger of 5 or 10 is 10. All right, so we're finished with this statement. Let me go ahead and step out. We're now finished with that statement. So when I step over, it simply goes to system pause and then return 0. So I can go ahead and continue, and then it's going to take me right back to this output console screen. All right, so that is a general introduction, quick introduction to functions. What does a function do? It does some chunk of code. It executes a chunk of code. And the whole purpose of that is you want to call it over and over and over again, as opposed to typing this chunk of code over and over and over again. Hey, create a function. In this case, I want to find the minimum of something. So great, once I've created that function, now I can call upon it over and over and over again, so that I don't have to keep on typing that same code over and over and over and over again. Okay. You also learned about global variables, and then you also learned about some of the different functions that return values, that don't return values, that accept parameters, that don't accept parameters, and then mixing and matching those. These are called the function prototypes. You always start off with this, and then you go down to the bottom and create your function definitions. I remember I had one student say, hey, do I have to have function prototypes? No. I could take all this, let's say that I copy and paste this, and I could replace all of this. If I wanted to put my function definitions up here and not have any function prototypes, that's perfectly acceptable. Your function definitions have to be on the top, and they have to be listed here before your int main program. That's the catch. So if you wanted to have function definitions up here, that's fine. You just have to make sure they're on top of the main function. Now, in general, this is the convention. Create your function prototypes, so it kind of gives you a heads up view, a top level view of the function names, what they receive, and what they return, if they return anything. Okay, by the way, could I return a double? Sure, I just simply type in double over here. Can I return a string? Well, if I included the string library up here, yeah, I could include a string. How about a bool? Can I return a bool? Sure, you can return whatever you want, right? The idea is that a function, if it's going to return something, you just have to put what it is that it's going to return over here. If it doesn't return anything, then you just simply put void. Now, you don't have to put void inside of the parentheses here in terms of if it's not going to receive any parameters, just leave them blank over here. Same thing over here. Hey, get user age does not receive any parameters. Just leave it blank like that. And that's it. All right, so this is Professor Robert Solis. I hope this video lesson was helpful. Have a good day. See you next time.